Welcome back to Theology Today. In our first episode of New School PCUSA, The Sparks of Rebellion, we traced the deep theological and cultural currents that pushed the church to the edge of a historic cliff. We watched as Nathaniel William Taylor's theological modifications, the rapid growth of frontier churches under the Plan of Union, and failed heresy. Trials left the entire denomination locked in a severe ideological stalemate. By 1837, the internal tension within the regional leadership had officially reached its absolute maximum legal limit. The church was no longer merely disputing abstract points of doctrine, it was wrestling over two entirely incompatible understandings of Christian mission, ecclesiastical authority, and corporate identity. This episode plunges us directly into the legislative crucible where that stalemate was violently broken. Today, we explore the underlying ideological divide that permanently fractured American religious history. We explore the sharp division between Princeton's strict confessionalism and the New School's activist pietism. We will dissect the 1837 coup, examining the precise manner in which it occurred. We will examine how a sudden national financial panic and mounting Southern anxieties handed the highly conservative old school faction a decisive, powerful legislative weapon against their rivals. Finally, we will unpack the exscinding acts and the historic walkout, the dramatic public process through which four entire regional synods were completely cast out of the church, resulting in a massive physical split directly on the crowded floor of the 1838 General Assembly. Prepare yourself for the high-stakes politics that completely altered the landscape and dramatic courtroom battles that permanently fractured American Presbyterianism. Join us as we uncover the structural maneuvers that brought an end to an era of ecclesiastical cooperation. Beneath the fierce debates over theology and mission strategies lay a fundamental disagreement regarding the nature of the church itself. The old school, new school division represented a classic manifestation of the perpetual tension between strict confessionalism and experiential pietism. These two factions did not merely disagree on details, they operated from entirely different theological paradigms. The old school perspective was intellectually anchored at Princeton Theological Seminary, championed by theological giants such as Charles Hodge and Samuel Miller. This influential Princeton theology vigorously defended a strict, literal subscription to the Westminster Standards. To the old school mind, Christian devotion and orthodoxy were best preserved through corporate confessions and orderly church courts. They asserted that the traditional forms of faith, including historic creeds and Presbyterian polity, provided the only reliable criteria for evaluating spiritual health. Furthermore, the old school championed a doctrine known as the spirituality of the church. This unique ecclesiology asserted that the church had no business embroiling itself in secular political movements or independent social crusades, arguing that its divinely appointed task was strictly limited to the proclamation of the word and administration of sacraments. Conversely, the new school operated on a foundation of warm pietism and aggressive social engagement. For this faction, external religious forms and strict creedal subscription went only skin deep, arguing that genuine faith required active demonstration of the Holy Spirit's presence through powerful revivals, holy living, and a thorough transformation of American society. This belief undergirded their enthusiastic support for the Protestant Benevolent Empire, a vast interdenominational network of independent organizations dedicated to temperance, education, Bible distribution, and abolition. This ideological divide translated into a bitter struggle over voluntary societies and institutional control, because old schoolers believed the church itself was the only divinely ordained missionary agency. They were deeply wary of Presbyterian participation in independent agencies like the American Home Missionary Society, which operated entirely outside the constitutional oversight of the General Assembly, meaning they could quietly channel unorthodox New England-trained pastors into Presbyterian pulpits without any denominational accountability. The old school demanded that all missions, education, and publication efforts be organized into official denominational boards directly answerable to the General Assembly. The New School, however, fiercely resisted this, viewing denominational boards as slow, rigid, and prone to spiritual complacency. This institutional stalemate over governance and missionary funding set the stage for a dramatic legislative showdown that would permanently alter church history. The escalating tension reached a breaking point at the 1837 General Assembly, culminating in an extraordinary and highly controversial legislative maneuver. Recognizing that individual heresy trials had failed to cleanse the Church of perceived error, Old School leaders coordinated a decisive effort to seize control of the assembly and completely sever their rivals from the entire denomination. This strategic mobilization succeeded due to several intersecting factors in the spring of 1837. First, Old School partisans aggressively raised travel funds to ensure their rural and Western delegates could attend the assembly in Philadelphia. Second, the historic panic of 1837, a sudden financial and commercial collapse, disrupted travel and business, preventing a full representation of elders from the heavily New School Presbyteries of New York and Northern Ohio. Finally, Southern Presbyterians, who were increasingly alarmed by the radical anti-slavery pronouncements of Northern New School reformers, traveled to Philadelphia in unprecedented numbers. By aligning with the Northern Old School faction on theology and church polity, these Southern delegates helped secure a solid conservative voting majority. Armed with a voting majority, the Old School-dominated assembly executed a swift constitutional strike. They began by retroactively abrogating the historic Plan of Union of 1801, declaring it an unconstitutional compromise that had never been properly ratified by the presbyteries. With the legal foundation of the plan demolished, the assembly took the radical step of passing the exscinding acts. They declared that because the synods of Western Reserve, Utica, Geneva, and Genesee had been organized under the unconstitutional Plan of Union, they were not and never had been legally part of the Presbyterian Church. By a series of majority votes, the assembly summarily expelled 4 entire synods, 28 presbyteries, 509 ministers, 599 churches, and over 50,000 communicant members. Without formal charges, hearings, or judicial trials, nearly half of the New School's institutional strength was exscinded or cut off from the denomination entirely overnight, sparking widespread outrage. Shocked by this sudden expulsion, New School leaders convened in Auburn, New York, in August 1837 to coordinate their response. The resulting Auburn Declaration, drafted by the Reverend Baxter Dickinson, served as an authoritative public explanation of how the New School interpreted the Westminster Confession. The document was written to answer 16 specific charges of heresy and Taylorism leveled against them. To counter these accusations, the Auburn Declaration made several core doctrinal affirmations. It asserted that election was based entirely on God's sovereign, eternal counsel rather than a foreknowledge of human faith. It affirmed that all of Adam's posterity suffered the spiritual consequences of his original sin, and it declared that human salvation depended entirely on the regenerating power of the Holy Spirit. The Auburn Declaration demonstrated a moderate 19th century Calvinist orthodoxy. Though the document failed to prevent the immediate split, it served as the theological bridge that allowed them to comfortably reunite decades later. The formal completion of the schism occurred at the opening session of the 1838 General Assembly, held at the 7th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. When the assembly convened, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. The Old School moderator flatly refused to recognize or seat any commissioners representing the exscinded Northern synods. Realizing that the conservative leadership had no intention of compromising, the New School delegates executed a pre-planned, dramatic response. From the floor of the assembly, New School leaders formally voiced their protests. When their objections were summarily ruled out of order, they declared the moderator's actions a direct violation of the church's constitution. They immediately nominated and elected their own moderator, Erastus Gilbert, and physically walked out of the building en masse, turning their backs on the historic assembly floor. The departing commissioners marched directly down the street to the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia, where they quickly organized their own rival General Assembly. From that afternoon forward, two entirely parallel bodies claimed to be the sole legitimate heir of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, permanently fracturing the denomination. This physical division immediately triggered a prolonged and bitter legal battle over denominational funds, valuable properties, and corporate identity, culminating in a landmark state Supreme Court case. The new school won a decisive initial victory in a lower court, which ruled that the exscinding acts of 1837 were completely unconstitutional and that the new school assembly represented the true legal continuation of the church. However, on appeal, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reversed this decision entirely. The High Court ruled that the General Assembly, as the supreme legislative and judicial body of the church, possessed the absolute legal right to determine its own membership and dissolve its own constituent bodies. This definitive ruling secured the legal assets, theological seminaries, and historic institutional lineage for the old school assembly, forcing the new school to rebuild from the ground up. The physical walkout at Seventh Presbyterian Church was only the beginning of the disaster. With the creation of two parallel General Assemblies, the intense battle quickly migrated from the church sanctuary directly to the secular courtroom. The landmark case of Commonwealth versus Green exposed the deep, painful institutional wounds of the schism, ultimately leaving the new school legally stripped of its historic assets, its corporate treasury, and its institutional inheritance. Though the legal battle was definitively settled, an even larger crisis was mounting on the national horizon. The new school was left to rebuild its entire institutional infrastructure completely from scratch. But both factions were about to be caught in the inevitable path of a gathering national storm. The deep theological disputes of the 1830s were soon overshadowed by a far more volatile moral crisis: the intense national struggle over chattel slavery. In our final episode, we will follow both schools as they navigate the profound trauma of the American Civil War, struggle with intense sectional division, and ultimately discover an unexpected historic road back to one another. Join us next time for Part 3, New School PCUSA, the return of the New School PCUSA.